Thank you for joining us, everybody. I'm just going to do a brief introduction. Tomorrow, August the 15th, is the 75th anniversary of VJ Day, when the surrender of the Japanese forces was announced and World War II finally came to an end. Before a formal signing ceremony of Articles of Surrender on September the 2nd aboard the USS Missouri, this brought to a final close 6 long and hard years of hostilities across the globe, ending both combat operations and freeing the many Allied prisoners of war that had been taken in places like the then Ceylon and Singapore when they fell in 1942. It was a victory quite literally hard won under the shadow of the mushroom clouds of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August the 9th, with all the moral and practical questions that Allied leaders balanced in their efforts to avoid a long and costly ground campaign against Japan. The impact of the events in the then Far East was strongly felt across the Northwest, which sent arguably more combatants and support staff outside the world than any other region in the country. Anecdotally, that is. As we'll hear today, many local soldiers were captured and joined both the Japanese prisoner of war camps and being forced to build the notorious Burma Railway. They carried, and in some cases still carry, although they are fallen in number, the memories of that experience with them as they return to a Britain rebuilding itself in a new and changed world. It was a Britain that had already started to rebuild its society after installing Winston Churchill as wartime Prime Minister in 1939. Britain then elected Clement Attlee as Prime Minister on the 26th of July 1945, with his remit of Britain having almost certainly won the war, then winning the peace. What the veterans of both the Far East campaign and the wider World War came home to was a new government that birthed the NHS and oversaw an almost total overhaul of our welfare state system 75 years ago this year. Today, with the help of our former MP and historian Gordon Marsden and others, we're going to look back at events around VJ Day, from the history of the conflict against Japan to the real experiences of veterans from Blackpool and across the Northwest. We did hope to have Roland Best with us today, veteran. Unfortunately, Roland isn't very well, so he won't be with us, but we do send him our best wishes. What that sadly illustrates is that 75 years is a long time, and the anniversary may well be the last with any significant number of veterans left to share with us their stories which are important and should be preserved to help stop us and future generations making the mistakes of the past. We already see echoes of the 1930s in the resurgence of nationalism, populism, hatred and division that cast their long shadow across our 21st century world. That's why looking back at their experiences today is so very valuable for us in the future. If you visit the Arboretum in Blackpool, you will find a monument from the Burma Star Association commemorating those who gave their lives in Burma between 1941 and 1945 that reads, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow we gave our today." Today, we begin by taking a minute to think of their sacrifice and the sacrifice of all veterans across the years. So we'll just have a minute's quiet.
This Saturday marks 75 years since VJ Day, which saw the end of the combat in the Pacific and Southeast Asia and brought to a close 6 years of conflict across the world. It's an often overshadowed piece of history of World War II, a sometimes forgotten final act in the conflict. But it wasn't forgotten by those who fought in it or by their loved ones. It wasn't forgotten by those who lost a son or a husband or a mother or a father. And we cannot forget those who served, men and women, because while they fall in number each year, if we forget them, then we forget the lessons that their history teaches us. And 3/4 of a century later, as we see the resurgence of nationalism, hatred and division, these are lessons that we ignore at our peril. The North West bore a large part of the brunt of sacrifice in this battle, including places like Blackpool, whose own recently formed 137 Regiment was caught up in fighting the Japanese in Malaya. Many were taken prisoner after the fall of Singapore in 1942 and endured unspeakable hardship in prisoner of war camps or were forced to work on the terrible Burma Railway. The scars carried by those who returned weren't just written across their bodies. It wasn't just service people. Civilians, including British women and children, suffered terribly as prisoners in overcrowded camps from starvation, disease and mistreatment. And although we are rightly appalled by the spectre of war, we are grateful for the sacrifices made by all our veterans and our servicemen and women to keep us safe, then and now. So tomorrow, we will reflect on the celebrations that took place 75 years ago, on their relief that the war was finally over, and we'll remember those who served, because they didn't forget us.
By 1941, the Second World War had been raging across Europe for several years and was not going the Allies' way. Setback followed setback. In the Far East, Germany's ally Japan attacked US forces at Pearl Harbor, invaded territories across the Pacific, and rapidly advanced towards Malaya and the impregnable British fortress of Singapore. Thousands of British and Australian troops were sent to defend the colony. For many, this was to be the defining moment of their lives.
It was terribly British stuff, really. You know, tremendously British, and for a time when we should have been training, we didn't, and so we went really into war not well trained at all. I mean, we were hardly trained. It was crazy.
The Japanese, they had tanks, they had armoured cars, but they also had bicycles, and those bicycles won their war. And then we were told, all men march, 150 kilometers.
I mean, the question of escaping was something that one occasionally thought about, but very quickly dismissed, because you had at least 1,200 miles of sea with lots of islands in between, admittedly, 1,200 miles before you could get to safety, or 1,200 miles up country onto the Burma front.
If you fell by the wayside, couldn't go any further and nobody could help you, you were left to die, or they made sure you died. It's called the Death March. It's been very difficult with the family because I never spoke about it. My wife died without knowing.
I couldn't sleep properly for about 10 years. That sounded a long time, but I could only just sleep under the surface. I mean, in the camps, you just slept under the surface. You were ready to move off because they might come in and start beating people up, turn everybody out for a working party. You didn't know what was going to happen by day or night very often. And so you slept like that, and I knew exactly where everything of mine was so that I could put my hands on it. Especially my little few drawing things. And so you were always ready to move. And when I came home, it was much the same. I would fold my clothes up and I sit in the way I do now, and I know just where they are.
Gordon's written a piece for the Gazette tomorrow, locally, which for people that join us who aren't from Blackpool is our local paper. Gordon was the MP, if you want, from Blackpool in Blackpool South from 1997 until last December. Done an awful lot. I think you'll tell us, Gordon, with veterans, the local Burma Star Association. And Gordon is a historian of some merit. So we're going to turn this over to Gordon for a little while, who is going to share with us some of the background around VJ Day and the people that served locally.
Well, thank you, Simon. And again, a great thanks to Angela Rayner for setting that in context and showing, as our deputy leader, that, we do value the celebration, the commemoration that's going to be taking place tomorrow. As Simon says, I am a historian by training. Before I became an MP, I was editor of the magazine History Today. And in Parliament, Joan Humble, who was my colleague at the time, I was elected for Blackpool North and Fleetwood, set up the all-party veterans group, and I chaired that until last December. I also had the benefit of having parents who had both served in the Second World War. My father was in the Merchant Navy, my mother was in the Army, and also the pleasure and the benefit of being able to talk to some of the key people from Blackpool who were involved in that conflict. And then they were called by some people the Forgotten Army. They fought 4 long years in the Second World War conflict. As we heard, they endured horrendous conditions. So there are very good reasons why they shouldn't be forgotten by people in the Blackpool area and across Lancashire, and nor will they be. The list of regiments and battalions that are involved from all parts of the county bear testament to that imprint in families and memories locally. Tens of thousands of those who were captured only arrived weeks before Singapore surrendered. The Blackpool 137 regiment we just mentioned was shipped out on an ex-liner, the Dominion Monarch. It took a 2-month voyage from England, and they got to Singapore at the end of November 1941. 700 troops arrived, 28 were killed in action, and 184 subsequently died in captivity. And we need to bear in mind that at least a quarter of the men and women who were taken to those camps didn't survive the war. Singapore was supposed to be impregnable. It was Britain's key base for Southeast Asia. It was a humiliation which Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. And it was marked by atrocities. Japanese forces massacred wounded soldiers and nurses at the city's Alexandra Hospital. Now, by contrast, the war in Burma was a much longer haul. There was a desperate attempt to stop the Japanese using their overrunning of Burma to invade India. And that reached its climax in the Battle of Kohima, just inside India. The reconquest that came by Britain's General Slim, tactically brilliant campaign. He won the hearts and minds of his troops by his attention to their health, because what you have to appreciate is the horrendous physical circumstances in which people fought and everything else. Jack Neild, whom I will quote, who I knew very well and who was the Burma Star's welfare officer in the early 2000s, in documents that are in Blackpool Library, said the temperatures often exceeded 45 centigrade, humidity 97 to 98%, Bengal foot trot, ringworm, endemic malaria, sunburn, which turned in later life to skin cancer. In 1943, the ratio of people who succumbed to disease as opposed to battle was 121 to 1. Because of the efforts of General Slim, by 1944, those had reduced greatly. As I say, I got to know two people very well, Ian Mitchell and Jack Neild, in the 1990s and through my period as the MP. Ian was captured at just 17 and sent after a spell of the POW in the Changi prison camps to work in a succession of camps in constructing the notorious Burma-Thailand Railway, while Jack, who was posted as a Morse code signalman in India, was involved in the battle for Kohima that denied Japan that prize. You've already heard about the Kohima epitaph, and for several years at the Remembrance Day ceremony at Blackpool Cenotaph, I was privileged to hear Jack intoning those words. And those sentiments were sadly in short supply, again, as we've heard, by the time that they got back to Britain. As the historian Claire Makepeace put it, victory celebrations had faded for most Britons. A quarter of those people were dead, and many of those who returned were in a fragile state, mentally and physically. They had recurrent bouts of fever or chronic diarrhea. Others felt shame and guilt about the surrender, and it was a more reserved age. Some took decades to have it out. One POW, Jack Chalker, who has captured life in his drawings in the Burma Railways camps, had a physical block even being interviewed on it in 2010. Tales of random beatings existing on less than a cup of filthy rice most days. Dysentery reducing prisoners to living skeletons. Tropical ulcers caused by bamboo cuts when working in the jungle. These were not the sort of things that came tumbling out. And it took films like The Bridge Over the River Kwai, despite historical inaccuracies, and the 1980s BBC TV series, Tenko, which showed the suffering and mistreatment of British and other civilian women prisoners, for people to recognise this. So how did the FIPOs react, the Far East Prisoners of War react to this? They reacted by looking to each other for support. They set up the Burma Star Association in 1951. Viscount Slim was its first patron. And local organisations, particularly FIPO groups in Lancashire, began to call for compensation. We know that about half of Britain's Far East Prisoners of War joined a club or association at some point in their lifetimes. And here in Blackpool, for over 20 years, from 1986 to 2008, the Winter Gardens was the place where they held their summer reunions for families and members. And it was a privilege for me to be at those reunions and to learn by listening to the veterans just how close their bonds had become. As I say, Ian Mitchell and Jack Neild were two of those most remarkable people. Ian, when he was demobbed, eventually came to the file to work on premium bonds. And when I met him in 1997, he was retired and living in Marton. He was a volunteer, actually, in my South Shore office. He had then published, and I've got the signed copy that he gave to me here, this book, Prisoners of the Emperor. The historian Sibylla Jane Flower sums up his achievement in his introduction to Ian's book, her introduction. Ian recounts this story with clarity, dignity, and humour. He owed his life, actually, to his battalion medical officer, who got smuggled into Ian's camp, the emetine drug that pulled him through amoebic dysentery. His brother Ron also survived working on the Burma Railway, but their third brother, Malcolm, was sent to North Borneo, where we believe he died in a Japanese massacre of POWs in November 1944. Now, Jack Neild, as I say, was indefatigable in getting me and other MPs locally casework to support those constituents who he represented. I learned from Jack how many servicemen were still 50 years on developing conditions from those mental and physical conditions directly attributable to their Burma experience. He was an absolute tiger, and he brought me his last case just before he died in November 2007. By then, there'd been a sustained campaign both inside and outside Parliament by FIPOs, the Royal British Legion, Burma Star, and that culminated in 2000 in a one-off payment by Tony Blair's government, which he said repaid a debt of honour to former prisoners. But the sadness, of course, was that for many it had come too late, and survivors have dwindled since. My good friend Roland Best, who I've known for nearly 30 years, who was a Burma veteran, still lives with his wife in Blackpool. But South Shore Royal Marine veteran Derek Coyle, who saw service both in Normandy and Burma and was often at the Burma Star events, died just before D-Day this year. But it's there with the Burma Star Garden, which was created in 2016, with a memorial inscribed with the Kohima epitaph and replicas of the Changi prison gate, that the VJ anniversary will be remembered this Saturday. Thanks to a legacy from a local Burma Star veteran and with assistance from Redeeming Our Communities in concert with Blackpool Council, Liz Clayton and her fantastic team of Burriton volunteers have worked tirelessly to prune trees and create a new Burma Star arrangement in time for this final salute to the Burma Star Association. In that garden, there's a memorial which includes a tribute to Jack Neal. I'll be paying my respects to Jack and Ian on Saturday, and to all those who fought and suffered in the Far East. As Angie has said, those experiences and sacrifices need now to be communicated locally in schools and to young people. These are stories of real people whose courage and endurance, when many of them were just in their late teens or early 20s, can teach lessons of comradeship and selflessness for our own times. In the debate supporting the FIPOs in April 1998, I said in Parliament, for the living to do justice, however belatedly, to people who died in the prison camps and to those who suffer still today also matters. Injustices don't go away in history. If we can remain proud of all that's been done, past and present, locally here in Blackpool and elsewhere, to live up to those words in the Kohina epitaph, then those words stay fresh and relevant for those who come after us.
Marvellous, thank you. No, very insightful comment. Very important we remember the lessons that what they went through, the things they endured, especially as you've highlighted very, very clearly there, 75 years removed from VJ Day, we are sadly, the one thing where none of us can beat is time, and we are losing these voices. So important to remember them while we can, and to try and you know, record those voices and those lessons, very definitely.
Hi, I'm Sharon Hodgson, the Member of Parliament for Washington and Sunderland West, and I'm Shadow Veterans Minister. I'm really sorry that I can't be with you today in person to remember and pay tribute to those who served in the Far East during the Second World War. As we know, they fought under the most harrowing conditions imaginable, and if they were taken prisoner, they suffered horrific treatment. VJ Day is often overshadowed by VA Day in May, but it was the surrender of Japan in August of 1945 that marked the end of the Second World War. Over 1 million servicemen and women from Britain and across the Commonwealth were to be demobbed and transported home, many of whom returned home to countries they no longer recognised after years of conflict and turmoil. As you know, troops returning from the Far East to the UK returned to the first Labour government under Clem Attlee, which rebuilt the nation and created the welfare state and the NHS that we know and love today. The Second World War brought this change, but for some veterans, their experiences at war never left them, and they battled with their own personal trauma. The same issues exist today, sadly, with men and women leaving the service in need of additional support to transition into civilian life. And this is something that I and my colleagues in Parliament help people with every day, helping people access the services and the support that they need and deserve. Whilst we remember those in the Far East and share their stories, let's also recommit ourselves to ensuring that all veterans have access to the care and support they need, as the founding principles of the Labour Party set out. As Labour's Shadow Minister for Veterans, that is what I hope to achieve when we're in government. I hope you all enjoy today's events, and once again, I'm really sorry I can't be with you. Thank you.
With dramatic success, our cameraman Oscar Boville in Burma turns in the first combat pictures from regions of the Arakan front. Keeping abreast of our advancing troops, he shows how men fling themselves across Japanese barbed wire to allow those following to walk over their prostrate bodies. This is the province of jungle hunters, the specially trained troops of Lord Louis Mountbatten's 14th Army. Regiments from every part of Britain, from the Highlands to the home counties, and the warrior soldiers of India, the Gurkhas, the Jat Sikhs and Punjabi Muslims. A mountain battery of 25-pounders shelling the Jap positions with a creeping barrage, the pulverizing process which precedes an infantry attack. In open formation they advance, spied upon by Jap snipers hidden in treetops across that fire-swept glade. No hint of hesitation as they stride forward, erect, well-disciplined, towards the darkly timbered forest to the other side. Stretcher bearers dart forward, bending low to pick up men who have been hit and lie exposed to further injury. The Red Cross men who give life to save life. Japanese dead are met with, blasted out of treetops by guns and mortars, or sent tumbling to the ground in a limp heap by automatic weapons and rifle fire. Men prod with their bayonets in search of the crafty Japs who seek to escape by hiding. Behind the trees, you see men crawling towards what looks like a large bush. It's an obstacle placed by the Japs in the path of a jungle track. It's also a possible booby trap where a branch of a tree pulled aside might fire a charge. Having placed their explosive, the men cut back to where a covering force is concealed and the detonator fired. The destruction of the barrier complete and the track safe, the infantry advance over the ridge. Some are detailed to clear the debris, and others to open out fanwise to search the ground for any concealed enemy machine gun nests. The road is open now for the bringing up of light mountain guns, an assembling of forces for an attack on a Jap-held village. The forward edge of the village is subjected to mortar fire laid down by men of a British regiment. Out of cover comes the first wave. The Japanese, taken completely by surprise, put up very little resistance in the first half of the village, but opposition stiffened as the Gurkhas advanced deeper. Here goes the second wave. Scaling the precipitous side of a nullah to gain the crest and claim another small advance in this forbidding land of Burma. The hard and rough road which lies ahead of our 14th Army. Uphill work, no doubt, but the 8th and 5th Armies found that out too in their part of the world. Now we have a new label for seasoned veterans. Hats off to the 14th.
We're now going to go across to Connell Land, who is going to tell us a little bit of the story of his own great-granddad, who served in Blackpool's own 137th Regiment. So, Connell, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Simon. I'd also like to extend a thank you to our Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, for her comments, and to Sharon Hodgson, the Shadow Minister for Veteran Affairs, for her commitment to social justice and support for veterans. And also a thank you to our very own Gordon Marsden for his insightful historical analysis. I've been asked this afternoon to talk about my great-grandfather. His name was Harold Rhodes, and he was a prisoner of war in the Pacific during the Second World War. But before I talk about him, I would like to talk about the major loss of life that led to VJ Day. Not only did the Allied forces lose thousands of men, Japanese citizens were grossly affected by the decisions of Emperor Hirohito. It must never be forgotten how victory was won in the Pacific. The detonation of 2 nuclear weapons secured victory in Japan. Thousands of innocent Japanese citizens lost their lives in the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the most brutal of ways. A combination of Hirohito's reluctance to surrender and the United States' determination for total victory led to this dark point in our modern history. So, whilst we remember the great cause and victory in the Pacific, we must also remember the great loss of innocent lives. We can only hope that such weapons will never need to be used again. Returning to my great-grandfather, he was a prisoner of war for 2 years during World War II. He was in the 137 Regiment out of Blackpool, and most of that regiment were either killed or captured. I often find it difficult to comprehend that he was my age, merely 22 when he went off to fight for his country. He was captured following a Japanese advance on the Malayan Peninsula. The Japanese forces were advancing, and my great-grandfather's commanding officer made the surprising decision of surrendering to the Japanese forces. He was subsequently detained in Thai Camp Malaya until the camp's liberation towards the end of 1945. His time at the camp was hard. Whilst in the camp, prisoners were fed only rice and had a very small ration of water. Many people in the camp died from thirst or starvation. My great-grandfather spoke of the illnesses he suffered in the camp. Because of the little amount of food and water available, he suffered from beriberi because of the lack of nutrients. This caused his stomach to bloat and become extremely painful. The severe lack of medical supplies in the camp meant there was nothing to mitigate his pain. There was a time when he had a terrible ulcer on his leg. And because of the lack of medical supplies, it went untreated. This caused his leg to become infested with maggots. In order to remove the maggots from his leg, he had to use salt. Now, I can't begin to comprehend how much pain that would have caused him. And he bore the marks of that ulcer for the rest of his life. The worst injury he suffered, however, was not identified until he had returned from the war. Several months after his return to Blackpool, he was diagnosed with malaria. Now, it seems unbelievable that malaria could persist and continue with him after all that time. By all accounts, his doctor was astounded at that severe misfortune. Also, whilst in the camp, he was able to communicate with his wife, whom he had married just before he travelled to the Pacific. Prisoners were given a card with a pre-written letter. They were asked to delete words as appropriate, such as whether the recipient was a parent, spouse, or child, and they were asked to delete whether they were well or unwell. This standard form letter was the only contact my great-grandmother had with my great-grandfather during his time in the camp. She wrote to him over 100 times, but the prison guards never passed these letters on to him. The Red Cross also sent aid packages to prisoners in the Pacific, but my great-grandfather, amongst others, never received any of this aid on the ground. He was forced to work on the Burmese Railway, laying tracks to help the Japanese war effort. The railway became known as the Death Railway because of the long hours worked and the lack of sustenance provided to the prisoners. Over 100,000 Allied prisoners died building the railway. I am very lucky that my great-grandfather managed to survive. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here to tell his story. On his return to the UK, he received very little recognition of the pain he had suffered. The newly elected Labour government did a great deal to help returning troops, with the development of social housing, the introduction of the National Health Service, and the broadening of the welfare state to support returning troops. However, these were all communitarian developments. Society was improved, but my great-grandfather still suffered a great deal from his wartime experiences. He was unable to sleep in the dark. He often woke screaming in the middle of the night because of nightmares, and he took up chain smoking as a way to relax. I imagine today this would be diagnosed as a form of PTSD, but in the 1940s there was very little help for returning troops on that front. He subsequently died in 1991, but that is not the end of the story. At the turn of the millennium, the Japanese government, in lieu of an official apology to those in prison during the war, offered each prisoner or their spouse £10,000. At the time, my great-grandmother was still alive, and this money helped pay for her care home fees. So there is a small element of solace that my great-grandfather's horrible experiences could be used to ensure the safety and security of his loving wife after he died. A great many people from Blackpool will have similar stories from the Pacific during the Second World War, and each one of them should be remembered as the great heroes who fought with the hope that our society would be in a better place for their sacrifice. Thank you.
No, thank you, Connell. That was to hear the actual stories that you've heard from your family really does illustrate what they had to endure. I think you said to me, and you said in that he was in the 137, which Gordon, you know a little bit about them as the local Blackpool regiment at the time. Oh, hang on. Can you unmute? Apologies for that. We muted sorry. Because a helicopter went over. Gordon and I were under the flight path.
Indeed. No, the 137 regiment were bumped up essentially from being a territorial army stuff, and so a lot of those people were very green, as it were, when they went out, and of course because they got there so quickly, so near to the Japanese surrender, they didn't actually have the right sort of training. I mean, it's interesting what you said and what you're about your great grandfather's situation. I've just been looking actually at Ian Mitchell's book, and there's a dramatic description by Ian of what actually happened to people who had cholera, which was very, very prevalent. And he says, men struck down by the disease were stretchered to an area outside the camp boundary. They were laid in mosquito nets so flies couldn't get to them. Medical orderlies helped them, but they dehydrated quickly with diarrhea and continuous vomiting. Their bodies contorted with cramp, they screamed and groaned in agony. The first indication was vomiting, and within a few hours of those first symptoms, the victims usually died of dehydration and exhaustion. And that was just one of those things. So your great-grandfather was lucky to survive the camps, and as I say, 1 in 4 of those people in the camps didn't. But if you rightly pointed out, they suffered for that later on in life. And one of the things that Jack Neal said was that it was difficult to try and get the war pensions people to approve new compensation. Compensation, incidentally, in 2000 was actually done by the Labour government. The Japanese sadly never accepted the need for reparations, and it was a tangled web, but it was, as you rightly said, a great comfort. It wasn't just about the money, it was also about the recognition, the fact that obviously was able to help your great-grandmother with nursing home fees. That was a good thing as well. But those are just, for every story of your great-grandfather's story and the story of Ian Mitchell, there are dozens and dozens and hundreds of other stories. And there are quite a lot in various files which I've not had the chance to look at, and they're there. But I think one of the things the 75th anniversary will do is to send people back to their local archives, tucking within their families. And that's why this is a very precious occasion.
Yeah. Connell, did you meet your great-grandfather, Connell, or was he, did you lose him before?
He like I said,
you were born?
He passed away in 1991. So he died 7 years before I was born. So everything that I know is passed down through my grandmother. But me and Gordon were talking a little bit about this before we started the event. Many people from that generation didn't like to talk about their experiences because they didn't want to A, show any weakness, but also B, they wanted to forget about it and move on. So there's a big gap in what we're knowing from people's own personal experience of the war because of that apprehension to talk about it.
Yeah, and if Simon, if I can just, I just want to show this to Connell, because he talked about the cards that we've got sent out. amazingly, in his book, Ian Mitchell has actually got two of Ian Mitchell's cards to his mother and sister who were in India did get through. And I'm just going to, I hope people can see it on the screen here. I'm just going to show that's an example of one of the cards which Connell was referring to. And the interesting thing at the bottom is, people may not be able to see this, but Ian Mitchell has said, "My regards to Winston, Spencer, and someone else," which of course was a coded reference to Churchill. But fortunately, the Imperial Japanese, you can see at the top, the Imperial Japanese Army heading. And so that got through. One of the things I can say, and this is very interesting, is that famed Vera Lynn, who sadly died at the ripe old age of 103 just a couple of months ago, she was very intrepid because she, of course, was the golden girl of the troops, and she wanted to go where the action was, and so she wanted to go to Burma. And of course, the powers that be were very worried because it was a dangerous area to go to, and it was a place where they could easily have crashed, and that would have been very bad for the national morale. But she insisted on going. So there is actually footage. I don't think we've got it here today. There is actually footage of Vera Lynn in the jungle, literally in the jungle, because the encampments were there. Singing all of those sort of songs, "We'll Meet Again," and "Bluebirds Over the White Cliffs of Dover," and all of those sorts of things. And those might seem very corny today, but to groups of young people, I mean, it would be, let's say, I'm going to be careful what I say. I mean, it's not quite the equivalent of Beyonce or someone like that turning up in the jungle, but nevertheless, it was a really well appreciated link with home, and that was the case. And Vera Lynn actually, after the war, spoke at and sang at a number of reunions, including ones in the Albert Hall. And I haven't been able to trace whether she ever sang at any of the Blackpool ones. The Blackpool one in 2000, which I was at, had the bachelors. The bachelors won't mean anything to many people under the age of 40, but they were a sort of soft folk group of the time. And they turned up because these reunion events weren't simply about talking about the war. They had comedy sketches, they had skits. The one I think that Simon's trying to get moving actually has General Slim starting off and praising the bravery of his troops and how they've been demobbed. And then you have one or two racy comics from the day sort of doing things. And then, in fact, there is Vera Lynn, I think, in the Royal Albert Hall, actually singing two or three of her, the things that she'd sung in the jungle. And you can see and hear from the audience in that video that it was on Pathé News, the reception that got.
With just what you stood up in, and precious little beside your arms, but you were on your feet and you were still fighting. And anybody who did that has got something that few men could be prouder of. Then in 1943, while the Air Force was battling its way back into the skies over Burma, we the soldiers learnt across the Chindwin and in the abortive attacks in the Arakan that courage alone was not enough. But in 1947 battles in Imphal and around Kohima, where body to body with bomb and bayonet, you again taught the Jap who was the better man. And while you were doing that, your comrades, the Americans and Chinese, helped by thousands of you, air landed behind the enemy, opened the road to China. At Imphal, you knocked the enemy out of action. Then recall that swift, exhilarating sweep of victory that carried you over the Irrawaddy into Mike Tiller and Mandalay. There you met the Japanese army in the open, and you tore it apart. That strange, grim struggle of little ships, aircraft, and soldiers up to their waists in mangrove swamps of the Arakan, that gave us the airfields which made the final advance to Rangoon possible. That race, one of the most thrilling races there ever was. A race against the weather, against time.
Person was seen approaching Chiswick. What wick? Chiswick. Chiswick? Oh, Alva. Five, not Chiswick, it's Chiswick. Wick. Are you sure?
Yes, Chiswick.
Let me have a butcher's. Chiswick.
Chiswick, yes.
Wick. It's quite right. The W is loud as in boarding house. That's right. I'll go to this one.
Petticoat, we are respectfully, we carry petticoat, sing most effectively. Stand on your way, we'll sing to you.
Tube trains to Penge, don't stop and through.
Good, oh for the power that the vocalist can sway, oh for the music that makes us glad and gay, for a man can be happy with a voice to call his own. He may either be a tenor, a sweet melodious tenor, or else a rich resounding baritone.
Now you have a go now, I'll have a lie down. Go on.
Oh, you're all right, you're all right.
Then get a second-hand stick of asparagus, double it, take away the weed killer for the wife's mother, and if you have any pears, well, just hang them out on the line on washing day.
The little things that made you cry, we'll remember as the best years of our lives. A day and a night, the plans that never did go right, we'll remember as the best years of our lives. And we'll walk together through moments of our yesterdays, remembering forever the corners we turned on our way. Now we clearly see that all the years ahead will be remembered as the best years of our lives. And we'll walk together through moments of our yesterdays, remembering forever the corners we turned on our way. Now we clearly see that all the years ahead will be remembered.
What I think is interesting is that, although you didn't see a lot of the audience, I think you'd agree, Gordon, to see them relatively youthful to come back, carrying the scars of what they'd been through, but many were only in their early 20s, if that, when they were taken prisoner of war or went into battle. So many of them were still mid-20s, late 20s, young men that came back.
And what you also see there is the guy who spoke at the beginning, of course, was Viscount Slim, and he was in very sort of stiff upper lip mode But he was respected as someone who'd actually moved through the ranks. He wasn't someone who was, come to the silver spoon in the mouth or Guards College education. So that's number one. Number two, as you say, young people and that, all very neat, all very, jackets, ties, etc. And then, of course, the voice of Vera Lynn, who was an extraordinary. She had an extraordinarily natural voice, and that was what got across to them. So it really gave them a sense, not exactly of the girl next door. That was Gracie Fields at the time, but of a real link. And in her songs, there's hope, but there's pathos as well, and that sums up what people felt in the late 40s. They wanted to feel that they were back in over the White Cliffs of Dover, but they wanted to continue the comradeship and the togetherness of those years. And I think there's a lesson there for us today. We're coming through our own sort of pandemic, a very different sort of experience, but it has, at its best, and I can only say that, it has had moments where it's brought people together, where the neighbours have talked to each other. And you get in that some echo of what it was like, and what my parents told me, of what it was like to live through the Second World War and its aftermath.
Yeah, well, your mother particularly, I think you've told me, and I hope you don't mind sharing the story, almost played a part in this.
She did. My mum was, she joined the army and she was assigned as clerical staff in 1943. Sorry, 1942, not 41. I'm getting it wrong. 41. And a few years before she died, I sat her down and did an oral history with her, and I was familiar with what she'd done in the Blitz and all the rest of it. And then we got to, and then she said, and then of course we thought we were all going to Singapore. And I looked and I said, Singapore? And she said, yes, because all the men in Singapore who were clerical staff, in those days, mainly clerical staff, were men. And when the Japanese invasion took place, they were all transferred into the Home Guard. That's what happened to Ian Mitchell. And so they still needed people to do the clerical stuff and pay the wages and all the rest of it. So basically, they were promised all these young girls, because my mother was only 19 at the time, would be shipped out to do that. And I said to my mother, well, what did you think about that? And she said, well, we didn't really think much about it at all, because we just knew that Singapore was quite hot and we thought we'd get a suntan. I mean, you've got to remember she was 19. And of course, we were quite looking forward to it because of, all the perfumes and the silks we thought we'd get when we got there. And she said, and we had all our jabs and all the rest of it ready for the voyage out. And the week before the ship was due to sail, Singapore fell. And I was astonished because the implications of that, it was the first time she'd ever mentioned this. And I said, you do realise that if you'd got to Singapore and you'd been captured, you would have been one of those people in those camps. And they said, and it's even possible that you and I wouldn't be here today to be having this talk. And so that's, again, the accidents of history. I mean, Ian Mitchell, in a prisoner of war camp, my mother potentially, if it had been earlier, doing his job and then being caught up in the same situation.
Yeah. And like you said before, the Tenko camps.
Yeah,
exactly. If you are of a certain age, you will remember from the BBC programme. But just showed, and that's something that we don't often realise. It wasn't just fighting men that got caught up in it, it was women and children.
Yeah. And in fact, the death toll in those camps was similar to the death toll in the POW, the servicemen's camps, and they were about 1 in 4, and the majority were of the sorts of diseases, that Ian Mitchell and Jack Neal describe in their things. And as I say, if it hadn't been for having a brilliant medical officer who actually smuggled what was actually a form of rat poison in. It was a a kill or cure treatment if you got the right sort of dose. It's a bit like steroids today. If you put too much steroids in, and it pulled him through. What it doesn't say, of course, is that the man who did that and saved his life had to make the decision not to give it to the other two people in his tent because they were too far gone to benefit from it.
Yeah, which shows the absolute horror and decisions that people had to make in those circumstances.
And that doctor who actually wrote to Ian and congratulated him on his book in 1997 would only have been in his late 20s or early 30s making those life and death decisions. Yeah.
Well, and this is largely, I think, what we don't always consider, that a lot of these decisions were made in the field, although the leaders like Churchill and Roosevelt, Stalin were older. The actual people who were conducting the business of war were teenagers, early mid-20s.
The vast majority of them. And in fact, if you got to 30, unless there was a particular need for you, you were considered too old.
Yeah, to play a part. I'll tell you something that came to me again this week. Apologies, I'm just going to have to plug the iPad in before the battery power goes and we all get lost. In looking at that, what I also noted that we don't always consider is quite how, as you would term it now, multicultural the fighting forces were. I think and very pertinent for the modern world, where we look back and we have this nostalgic history that it was all white British soldiers fighting, but actually soldiers from across the world.
Absolutely. And if I can just return basically to what happened in Parliament, and this will be within more recent memory, and that was because the Gurkhas were mentioned in the Pathy News. And of course, we have Gurkhas living now in Blackpool, and they turn up have turned up at the Royal British Legion, but they were not getting the pensions that they were due, and certainly not at the rate they were due. And a lot of these people were then in their 70s and their 80s, and there was a great campaign about that, and which actually Joanna Lumley took forward and pressurised the government at the time to do something about it. But yes, the Gurkhas, the Chinese who had joined in the Home Army, which Ian Mitchell got, those people were separated when the Japanese came through. Ian and his friends who were white were put into camps. The Chinese ones, including people that Ian had been at school with in Singapore, were taken to the beach and machine gunned. And Ian was told by the chaplain who buried, Japanese told him to bury these people, I think, on the beach, but two of them had been Ian's classmates.
Horrendous. And then again, well, there's no words, are there? It's difficult for us to comprehend with the remove that we've got from history, but actually to comprehend that happening. Staggering, isn't it?
But you're absolutely right. And Ian makes the point in the book of talking about the help that they got, actually even from the people in Thailand who were nominally supposed to be allied with the Japanese, who would smuggle them food, and lots of acts of random kindness by people along the way. Yeah.
In a lot of the videos I've watched this week and a lot of the pictures that I've found, because obviously at the time we had the empire, a lot of Indian soldiers, a lot of people from there that fought alongside, and I think that is something that we would do well nowadays to remember.
Yes, and if I can just introduce just one minor discordant note there. There were one or two MPs, I'm not going to name them, but some people will have seen the film 1917, which was done by Sam Mendes and was about the Western Front, and it includes a Sikh character in that. And one or two people sort of said, well, why have they got a Sikh character in there? you know, as if to say that it had just been a bit of Hollywood glitz. The truth of the matter was, in both in the First and the Second World War, that hundreds of thousands of Indian and Commonwealth troops lived and died for, you know, the British Empire, or whatever you want to call it. And that mustn't be forgotten. And it mustn't be forgotten because actually what it says, you know, is about what we can do today to have that multicultural awareness. You know, they fought for our king, emperor and country. We need to understand, and this is what this brings us back right to the whole business of Black Lives Matter, that actually for 100, 200 years, Black people, Chinese people and others have been working along with us, being involved in Britain's imperial wars and all the rest of it. And they need to be treated, and their memories need to be treated with the same respect as we would give to the memories and the service of the people who went out from Britain.
What you don't often hear about is the sexual slavery of the Japanese, especially towards the Koreans and the Chinese women. I mean, I've got the copy of the true stories of the Korean comfort women because I went to Korea and saw pictures that they still have in museums, and it's horrifying. It's most...
Yes, and of course, because today we've only had a certain amount of time, we've not been able to talk about the terrible atrocities that there were, you know, in China and the rest of it, and the Korean comfort women, as they were so called, who were basically sex slaves for the Imperial Japanese Army. There were still lawsuits going, but many of these women, of course, have died, but these are still going on. And there has been some progress, I think, in Japan, and they have had some awards. But you're absolutely right, and that's why I wanted to make the point about the women in the camps in Singapore as well, because again, you can get a very stereotypical picture from those Pathy News things, because of course you just see men fighting, but what that doesn't show is the position of women and children, not just British women and children, but Dutch, American, Chinese, Korean. You know, I mean, war does not discriminate. The horrors of war do not discriminate just to one group of people or another. And it's right that we talk about those things. And yes, they were terribly treated.
Definitely. We're just gone a little over time, so we'll do another 5 minutes. If does anybody else want to say anything, or any questions you want to ask about what we've talked about today? Anybody want to share any stories? Any family members? Oh, Pete, right. Can you unmute yourself there, Pete? Oh, still muted.
There we are. I think I've got that.
There you go. Perfect.
Yeah, I'm alive, right. No, just saying thank you very much. This has absolutely been great. Very grateful to Gordon for all he's done for the veterans and so on, and all the speakers. In particular, I'd like to sort of say to Connell, thank you for sharing your great-grandfather's experience. You did it with... you were able to express your horror at what he went through, but you were also able to have sympathy and compassion for the Japanese people. For somebody of my generation, particularly growing up in Blackpool, where there was a man in my street who was in the Japanese prisoner of war. One of my teachers was a prisoner of war. I worked with 3 people who were, were prisoners of war, and I know all the hardship that they went through, mentally and physically, all through their lives, numerous nervous breakdowns. And in Blackpool, it was very hard not to have, I will say the word hatred of what happened. And when the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, thinking, well, they deserved it. But that was caused by war. That was caused by war, and the compassion and understanding you showed. The other thing I wanted to say is I was born in 1950. Both my grandfathers fought in the First World War, right from the beginning till the end. My maternal grandfather was killed in February the 12th, 1918, and my mother and her two sisters and my grandmother lived in abject poverty for a number of years, as did hundreds of thousands of other people who lost men. And there was very little help. My dad was the eldest of 5 brothers, and by the middle of the Second World War, they were all in the war. My dad himself was a prisoner of war in Germany. But there was very little done in the 1950s or the 60s. War films were made in the 50s up to, say, 1965, which glorified war. As kids, we were indoctrinated with comics and so on, glorifying our, success in the war. But in terms of helping servicemen and women, nothing really happened until much, much later. I mean, Gordon's mentioned about compensation in the year 2000 and so on. For God's sake, that was years afterwards. And we only seem to, recognise the sacrifices people make when there is actually war going on. The Gulf War sort of, Alpha Heroes and so on, which is absolutely right. And we didn't recognise this until much later on. These poor guys and the people who lost people went for years, decades, without any sort of help and support.
Yeah.
No, you're absolutely
go on,
right.
Gordon.
No, the point I was going to make is that, I'm often asked as a historian, would I like to have lived in another time or whatever? It's a daft question, really, because it depends where you were in the social scale. But one of the things I think that, we're able to do today, and of course this is an issue about social media, but also about technology as well, to get those campaigns up and running, in those days. And there were movements in the 1950s, and there was some grudging compensation given, but in the 1950s, it's little known about. But it was then everything was pushed under the carpet. And it was only in 1998 when they discovered in the files that basically the British government hadn't pressed the Japanese government hard enough in the 1950s, because they basically, again, this is about history, Japan had become democratic. They needed Japan as a bulwark against communist China, and therefore they didn't press them that hard, to be blunt. But it was that process that then enabled and galvanized the movement in 1998, 1999. And to give Tony Blair credit, it was he who said, look, this has been brought to our attention, okay. And there are parallels. I mean, at the moment, the government is wrestling with a report which shows the terrible mistreatment of people who, and I had people in my constituency who had disabilities as a result of drug scandals from the 1960s, 1970s. Only now are those things being brought out. Only now is there a hope for compensation. And so it's never too, well, it is too late, obviously, for some of those people because they have died. But I think if you could talk to some of those people who had died, they would say, yes, I missed out on the compensation. And yes, we had all of these problems. But eventually, our sacrifice, our hardships were noted. And that, as a historian, I believe passionately that there are things that you can do to set these things right in history. But by God, it's much better to set right when people are still alive rather than when they're dead.
Yeah, when they're there to see that recognition. I think you're right, Pete, because we should have had there was another video that, due to the technology and the fact that I think the heat has defeated us a bit today, I will push out. And on that, you hear some of the voices of the people, the veterans. And there were a couple of them. One of them says, we came back and we were put in a transit camp for 2 days. And then we were just given a train ticket and we were sent home. And then another guy basically says they then did not share what they'd been through. So like he said, his wife died and didn't know. an interest in what Gordon said before about them being very neat. There is a guy that it was terribly moving. A guy that came on and said in an old documentary, I know where all my stuff is at night all the time because we would fold it neatly because we did not know if the Japanese would come in and move us to a working group. And he said, and obviously by the time they interviewed him, he was in his 70s, and he said, and that I still do that every night. I put them in the place that I did, and that stayed with me, basically. But yeah, they came home, and yeah, largely were not given the support you'd get now.
Could you say one more thing? One of my things that I studied as a professional in my professional life was masculinity, and I continue to do that now. But I've read numerous accounts of post-traumatic stress disorder from the First World War, Second World War, Korean War, Vietnam War, and so on, and horrifying stories. But the basic message that comes out of that, I mean, something you said before, we can't even imagine that, doing that, when you're talking about, you know, burying people on the beaches and so on. Human beings aren't meant to do that. It's not in us. It isn't in us to do those kinds of things or have them done to us. The things we see as human beings, you know, and war forces people to do those things and to experience those things, and we don't seem to learn. I think things have moved on in terms of PTSD. There's more counselling offered now, but I always have mixed feelings on Armistice Day because the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior is a marvellous thing, but at the same time there are hundreds and hundreds, if not even thousands, of known warriors living under railway bridges and so on and so on.
And that's true, particularly, and we've seen this recently with the statistics over, you know, what's happened to Afghan veterans and what's happened to veterans from Iraq. And when I was MP, every year at the cenotaph, there were the parents of Gunnar Lee Thornton, who was, you know, his name was on that cenotaph. And every year that I went there, and they were always there, it reminded me of all of our duties, and particularly those in Parliament or government, to think about the cost of war. Because, you know, you can't just dismiss it as something that happened, you know, 60 or 70 years ago, when you've got people who were either killed in recent conflicts or have survived, but the scars have been left, whether it's depression or drugs or alcohol or whatever. And that's what Sharon was saying in her, and what people like Dan Jarvis, who of course served, who's the mayor of Sheffield, but of course served in both, I think, Iraq and Afghanistan. But, you know, you need to give people that support, because a lot of those young veterans, some of them, you know, with virtually all of their limbs amputated in their 30s, you know, we have those issues that we can address today.
Yeah. We have one more question from Kendrick Fowler. Kendrick, what would you like to say?
Yes, just a lot of CLPs have talked about having a armed forces officer sort of work with local veterans. Is that something you would support?
Yeah, I think as a CLP, as the chair of Blackpool South, I think Gordon obviously can speak better on this than I can. As you know, you've done a lot of work with veterans. I think we as a party traditionally do not get. I don't think it's that we don't give or extend support to them. I think it doesn't come natural to us as a party to publicise that, and I think it is something, as Gordon will say, the work that you've done with veterans locally, the work that loads of MPs do with local veteran groups. Dan Jarvis talked about that when we had him on for your 30th. There is a lot, and for me, I think we obviously we are a peaceful people as Labour Party members, and we do have a lot of people, a lot of members who don't think we should have war. Well, the thing of it is, the reality is we do, and we can't forget the people that have put themselves in harm's way for us, no matter what we may think personally, for me, about conflict itself and whether we should go into conflict. I think it's a fantastic idea. I don't know what you think, Gordon, about that.
I think it is. One of the things that I was able to do when I was a member of Parliament, and we used to have every year a get-together of the local associations and that. And of course, this is reflected in terms of the Arboretum, because of course it is in Bispham, which is obviously Blackpool North, but actually it brings people from Wyre and Fylde, as well as Blackpool, people in Fylde, lost loved ones in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so, it might be something for us to think about, perhaps joining together, with other constituencies and that over that area, because then you've got a bigger catchment area. And to be frank, I mean, when I was doing that, I mean, it wasn't just something that we did with the Labour Party, and there were Conservative councillors. In Fylde who did a lot. Jim Holdsworth, who I knew very well, who was responsible for the initiative for the Arboretum, was a Conservative councillor in Marton, and obviously I disagreed with his party politics, but he was a very brave and a very compassionate person. And it was him and other people who actually were behind the Arboretum, and the council did their bit, and various other people, and the volunteers who will be commemorating the 75th tomorrow, following that tradition. But I do think it's important that as members of the Labour Party, after all, Clement Attlee, who succeeded Churchill, who I've spoken about and lectured on, saw service in the First World War, and so we do have these traditions, and I think it is right, but to say that whatever the circumstances of whether we agree with a war or a particular intervention or not, we must never forget about the people who experience those circumstances, who serve, and often are victims of them.
And not just the actual people that serve, a sacrifice is made by the families that stay behind, their loved ones.
Just one final thing. I don't want to get too personal, but I mentioned my father earlier on, who was called Harry, and who, as I say, he was in the Merchant Marine. He was named after my great uncle, who was the youngest brother of my grandfather, and his name was Harry, and he was sent to fight in France, and he was killed on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, age 19. He's buried in a small little cemetery in France, which I had the honour to visit some years ago. It's a beautiful place with about only 40, 50 graves there. But the family history, the family story is that when the telegram came, because there were always telegrams in those days, that my great-grandmother, my great-grandparents were living in Manchester at the time, my great-grandmother sat on the, those houses where you go and there's just stairs. And my great-grandmother sat on the stairs for 36 hours and would not be moved.
Which is an illustration, isn't it?
Yeah.
Of it isn't just the people.
No.
They don't go to war alone, do they?
No.
They carry other people with them, and other people carry what happens to them. No. Kendrick, did that answer your question? We would very much support that. Anybody else, anything they would like to say before we call it to a close? No? Well, thank you for coming on, everybody.